Very sad to report I do not have my deer stalker hat on, but it just messes up my hair so much. I can't. So here's a slide we wanted to show you. Some of the kind of top three, I guess, as far as the Sherlock Holmes stories: Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, Hound of the Baskervilles, A Study in Scarlet. And then if you go to the portal there's some great audio versions of those. So please check that out. Then I wanted to show you the agenda for today. We're going to start out with chatting with E.J. Wagner, who's the author of The Science of Sherlock Holmes. Going to kind of dive into forensics in the Victorian era and how that kind of relates to forensics today. Should be a good chat. Then we're going to go to Rachel, talking about the nitty-gritty details, hopefully more nitty than gritty. And then we have the enactors. You'll get to meet each of them, learn more about them. We'll have a little short break. During the break, you'll be able to check out some of the forensic tools that our speakers for the end of the session will bring with them. They're going to bring some things. There's a table set up right outside there. You can check out some of that, and they're from the Denver Forensics Center laboratories. So be sure that you take advantage of the opportunity to kind of get your hands on some of those real forensic stuff. Does that sound good? All right. So without further ado, I believe we're going to see if we can switch over and get E.J. Wagner hooked up here. Good afternoon, E.J. How you doing?
I'm fine. How are you?
Great. We have a great group of volunteers here. Everybody's kind of filling in, and I wanted to introduce you to them. Start out. E.J. Wagner is the author of The Science of Sherlock Holmes, From Baskerville Hall to the Valley of Fear, the real forensics behind the great detective's greatest cases. And she's also an expert on forensics in the Victorian era. And right now I want to pull up some of the many translations of this book. EJ sent me this picture. I just thought it was fascinating. You can see here all these great translations in many different languages. So this is a book that's had a lot of influence, and we're just thrilled that you're here with us today, EJ. So we're going to kind of facilitate a little bit of a dialogue here. I'm going to ask some questions, and EJ is going to answer. We'll have a little back and forth. EJ is going to dive into some things a little more in depth. We have some pictures that we're going to show you on the screen during this dialogue, and that should also be good. And then kind of at the end of the session, you all will have a chance to ask EJ some questions yourself, and I'll walk around with a handheld mic and we'll have you do that. So, EJ, I wanted to start out with the question of, what are some of these origins that you can think of, the origins of medical jurisprudence in the Victorian era? How did that kind of get started, and how might Sherlock Holmes fit into that?
Well, originally, we call it forensic science today, forensic pathology. But in those days, it was medical jurisprudence. It was a matter of applying science to biology and autopsies and dissection. And actually, in the early Victorian era, it was a tiny little footnote, usually at the bottom of a textbook on, of all things, obstetrics and gynecology. They sort of got you coming and going. One of the famous Professor Channing at Harvard specialized in obstetrics. But the reason there was a connection between these two extremes was because one of the big problems was stillbirth. Many pregnancies ended very sadly in a child that did not live. The question before the law was always, was the child born dead, or did someone smother this child? This was the essential issue that usually brought medical people before a legal forum. And many tests were done in the attempt to prove one way or the other, has this child breathed? Has he been part of the human population, or was he just a little tiny still thing? And so it was usually part of the course on obstetrics and gynecology. gradually, other disciplines began to say, we could use some of that information. And then we managed to reach out into the world of the hunters, what they knew about death from what happened to animals that they had caught for food.
Mm.
We reached out into the military, people who had learned how to track the enemy. And eventually we developed what we now call forensic science.
Hmm. So it sounds like there's really, a lot of what we consider today to be disciplines kind of coming together. So when we think about that, is that something that, you can kind of trace that back to Arthur Conan Doyle, or is that something that had kind of antecedents before that, things that might have happened that drew those different disciplines, military and medicine kind of together?
Well, you can go back before Arthur Conan Doyle, because Conan Doyle, as we know, was a physician. And one of his professors was the great Joseph Bell, who came from an illustrious family of anatomists. We still have the textbooks that Conan Doyle learned from. And dissection, of course, was extremely important. This came before the idea of autopsy. Dissection originally was done, how is this man made? How did this man live? What made this man or woman function? What purpose did the heart have? What did the lungs do? How did the blood circulate? This is really what it was. When we reach medical jurisprudence, the idea of applying this after death, now all of a sudden the focus has changed and we're asking, how did this man die?
That's great. So during this time, when we talk about the Victorian era, we're also talking about kind of the advent of photography. And Ben, if we could go back to the slides, I'd love to show one that's called staged restraint. How was photography used in these kind of early criminal investigations?
Much as I love that slide, oh yeah, here's the right one. Can you back that up a little bit so you can see a bit more of it? You're in there a little tight.
Yeah.
All right, the thing is, the beginning of photography as we know it was, of course, daguerre, which the first ones, daguerreotypes, is in 1839. And immediately, people who were in legal investigation thought it might be useful. The big issue here was identifying someone, identifying the body, and then identifying possible perpetrators. Now, this particular picture is of interest to me because of what is not there. Sherlock Holmes always said you always have to consider what is missing. What is missing here is any movement. We see hands trying to restrain the man in the chair. But in those days, when this picture was done, which was probably about 1902, lenses were very slow. You needed a very long exposure to capture that bit of light that made this image. And yet there is no movement. So obviously this is a staged photograph. It is not a real picture. I mean, it's a real picture, but it's not a picture of what was really happening. Probably one of the educators in the investigative world staged this in order to show his students, to demonstrate what it might look like if you had to restrain a prisoner to have him photographed.
So it's more like a teaching tool that they're using.
Exactly.
Yeah. So let's look at this next picture. This one's called Staged Fallen Burglar.
Well, this is the very famous Man in the Mud picture. The great French forensic specialist, Edmond Locard, who established the very first police laboratory in Lyon, France in 1910, used to use this as a teaching tool. And the story has come down that this is the image of a burglar who fell from a second story, landed in the mud, holding his weapon in his hand, and that the image was perfectly preserved. The problem here is that because the image is so very perfect, and if you think about it, if they had to pull this man out of the mud, the image would not be perfect. I believe that it is also a staged educational tool, and that because it was not labeled properly, as years went by, people copied it, stories began to grow around it. It has been taken as an actual photograph of a real event. I believe it is a staged example to educate students.
Interesting. Kind of urban legend grew up around this photo.
Exactly. But if you ask any forensic student about the face in the mud, this is what they're talking about.
The face in the mud. So we've seen all these staged photos. What you described kind of the exposure time. Like if you were looking at some historic photographs and trying to determine, and you could say definitively, yes, this is a true photograph that would have been used to determine, if somebody had committed a crime. What are some of the other kind of factors or things that you're looking for?
Well, one of the things you'd want is labeling, and this was Sherlock Holmes' big issue when he said, "My method." One was that you took very, very careful notes, and you had to be very careful about measuring everything. So, if you're measuring a corpse, what is the distance of the corpse to the wall? How many people had access? How many windows are present? How many doors are present? You want to make sure that no one has moved anything, that you are, at first they just drew it before we had photographs. They did careful drawings, but this all had to be kept in perspective. The photographer would have to make a note of exactly when he or she took each exposure, where the lens aperture was, because otherwise it's meaningless. It is not true that photographs don't lie. They not only lie, they lie very effectively.
They're very good at lying. Yes. Now with all the image altering software that's out there, it's even easier to do, right?
That's correct.
All right. So I did want to show one other picture that kind of relates to this idea of photography and criminal investigations. And this one is titled Mugshot here. I'm going to hopefully
I'm afraid you're back with the guy in the mud.
There's Mudman. There he is.
This is the first known mugshot. Comes from Belgium. It was made in 1843. And again, we notice what is not there. It is not labeled. We cannot tell the height of the subject. We can't tell the weight. We can't tell anything about them except that it appears to be a female person, probably younger than you'd think because people aged faster in those days. And somehow someone got her to remain very, very still for a very long time. It's a daguerreotype.
Certainly, she definitely looks grim, that's for sure.
And you notice also that she is looking slightly to the side. Today, when a photograph is taken, it would be straight on, right at the camera. Bertillon, who was a clerk in the Paris police, who rose to become of great importance, developed a very complex system of measuring the human body. It was called Bertillonage. And Sherlock Holmes mentions this with great admiration in his stories. One of Bertillon's great contributions to investigation was to introduce the idea of taking not only a straight-on photograph, but a profile. And this strikes us as being so obvious today, and it was so new and revolutionary then.
So what's the advantage of taking a profile photograph? I mean, I'm just going to play dumb here for a minute. Why would you even need to have that?
Well, it's one more factor in trying to identify somebody years later. The way the nose juts out from the face, whether or not the chin recedes or protrudes, all these things are little extra bits of information which go into your memory as, is this the person I've seen before? And one must remember that Bertillon was wrong about one thing. Well, a number of things. But anyway, he had a series of measurements he took of the human body, from the neck to the shoulder, from the shoulder to the elbow, the ears, how far they protruded. The trouble is that these factors do change with age. Sure. We lose height, our bone structure changes, muscles grow slacker, wrinkles appear, and so what you're left with, really, when you try to recognize someone years later, is very basic bone structure. Now, that profile, if you've got a great big jutting nose, that's something hard to forget. If the nose has been broken and it's been badly set, that is something you're going to remember. So those two things put together gave you much more information than just one more shot.
That's great. And I was thinking too about some of those other tools that might have been used. And so we're talking about photography, but of course this is also kind of the advent of a little bit more in-depth understanding of anatomy and physiology. And so I'm going to show a picture here. And oh boy, that's not sized very well. But what we do have is what are we looking at here? At least the torso.
You're looking at the torso of somebody who appeared in a medical textbook many years ago. Medical textbooks in the Victorian era were of more importance to the average person than you'd realize, because many people lived in areas where there were very few doctors available. And in order to but usually it was the woman of the house who did the nursing. She needed to have really quite a bit of understanding about the human body. So some of these texts were written for family medical practitioners as well. This example, which unfortunately you can't see the more interesting part of it, this gentleman seems to have a real problem in that he has no genitalia of any kind. And this was not presented as a medical condition. This was because they were trying to save the sensibilities of the lady of the house, who, of course, in actuality was handling bedpans and and diapers and was perfectly well acquainted with the male anatomy. But this was the kind of thing that was held up as an image for medical students: no genitalia.
Sure, it would be prurient to show the genitalia, right? I mean, that would be a horrible thing to do. So
absolutely,
yes. All right, so the next picture, I want to show another one that kind of shows this anatomy and physiology. This one's called Body with Ropes.
Well, this is from Joe Bell's great book on anatomy. And it shows us two things. This is 18th century, 1795. This book was published. This was the kind of text, this was a medical textbook that Conan Doyle would have read as a student. And the bodies that they used were usually those of executed criminals. You'll notice something interesting. He's hung on ropes there because where did we get the idea for how you dissect and execute a judiciously hanged human being? How do we go about it? Now, it seems to us today, very obviously, when you stretch him out on a table and you start doing the well-known Y incision, except the Y incision did not exist in those days. Bodies were very often hung like this because we got our ideas from butchers and from hunters. And that was the position in which you would have placed a deer if you were going to eviscerate him and dissect him for food. So a great deal of what we see of dissection in those days came from lots of different disciplines. Joe Bell wrote very famously, dissection is the basic need of the medical practitioner. All of medicine rests on dissection.
Right, without dissection, what do you have? All right, so let's look. I have one more here.
Well, this shows you a medical advance. They finally decided it would be a good idea to put the body on a table. But you'll notice the table is much too short. The legs hang over the edge. The thing was, in those days, they were not really thinking in terms of constructing furniture or apparatus to suit the needs of the medical profession. They repurposed what they had in their homes. As a matter of fact, the Borden case, I'm sure, even in Denver, I'm sure you heard of the Borden case. 1892, Lizzie Borden took an axe and you know the rest of it. Well, the autopsies, the original autopsies in that case were performed on the Borden's very own dining room table. And I frequently point out to people that you might keep that in mind when you go antiquing. Never be quite sure why that dining room table you're looking at covetously has acquired its patina.
That's right.
So it was a great advance when someone finally said, you know, we need a table that is made for the purpose. And this is so much of medicine is like this, something that is so obvious to us today, but it was like inventing the wheel. You know, yeah. I know, we just get a longer table and life will become so much easier.
It's true. And, you know, that really cuts to the heart of the issue here. Sorry, I can't help it.
No, I know, but you will also observe there is no Y incision there. That whole body cavity is opening just in a straight line from the chest down.
Yeah. So my next question really kind of pulls together a lot of the things that we've been talking about here. You know, Sherlock is considered this, you know, kind of a polymath. He uses his senses and information in a wide variety of ways and does pull in all these different things. You know, you might catch him, as James said last week, having a database full of plants from Papua New Guinea. I mean, these weird things that he pulls together and somehow draws conclusions. What are some of the ways that kind of, some of the lessons that we can have from Sherlock that we can use today for how we solve crimes? Anything?
Oh, sure. Well, Sherlock would say over and over again, the most important thing to remember is my method. And what he was talking about was what we call the scientific method. You observe certain things and you think you're seeing a pattern. Okay, so from this, we now form a hypothesis. Once you've done that, you have to test your hypothesis. You try to repeat the same circumstances as often as you can. And then, if you've got enough information, it's holding together. Now you have a theory. So when people say to you, it's only a theory, they're obviously not scientifically trained. That's just that means nothing.
Right.
A theory is really very solid. But even then, even with a theory, before it becomes considered a law, you must always be willing to retest it. You've got to be able to duplicate it. I mean, Newton observed that when an apple falls, it usually lands on the ground, whatever's below it. Most things, when they fall, go downwards. They don't go upwards. Unless there's a very strong gust of air coming up. We have to consider all the possible variables. And it is not good science and not good Sherlockian method not to be willing to retest, to constantly be open to new interpretations. Because very often we discover, especially in the forensic sciences, something was true today and tomorrow, not so much.
That's right.
Not so much.
That's a really, really profound point. This idea of Sherlock kind of as an educator, somebody who's sharing information and letting people know about all these things. What are some of those stories and relationships from Conan Doyle that might illustrate that? Can you just share a couple of those, maybe examples?
Well, one of the things that Conan Doyle very often used as a device was comparing superstition to reality, to science. And of course, I think one of the most famous examples is the Hound of the Baskervilles. When he goes back into the darkest part of British folklore, the idea that the dark dog, the black dog, was what they called a fetch, someone who was calling someone to a dreadful end, who would appear as sort of an invitation to death. And that's how the Hound of the Baskervilles begins. It's a hound that is hounding this family, appearing and destroying with it. But at the end of the story, there is a perfectly reasonable explanation for it. And that is precisely what science was like in those days. It was simply a matter of, I'm sorry, that was a phone that rattled me for a minute. It was a matter of taking these dark superstitions, which were absolutely believed to be true. And this is true in forensic science, as a matter of fact. If I can go off into this a bit. For instance, they were convinced, certain medical practitioners, that the hair and the nails grew after death. A number of very well-known physicians wrote entire books about this. They claimed to have observed it. Other very famous physicians wrote long papers about how the hair and nails did not grow after death. And we have experimented endlessly. The hair and the nails do not grow after death. What happens is that after death, the skin contracts, pulls back from the hair follicles on the face and from the nail, the dead cells which make up our nails, and it appears to be longer. And we've done this by leaving bodies exposed and measuring it. So we know this. But if you go back to a textbook written maybe 150 years ago, you have a doctor of very, very eminent, absolutely insisting that this growth is a fact. People have been sent to the gallows on the strength of evidence like that.
Wow. And in thinking about some of these false conclusions that are drawn, the superstitions, what were some of these kind of things that cropped up time and time again, these fallacious things. And actually, I have a couple of pictures I'd like to show. So Ben, if you could pull this up, EJ shared these with me. This first one is called Mr. Turkey handwriting here.
Well, this was the cataclysmic case in Boston in 1849, the Parkman-Webster case, where Dr. Parkman, who was a physician and a businessman, marched down a street in Boston and Cambridge, walked into Harvard Medical School, the sacred precincts of Harvard, walked up the steps, down a corridor to a laboratory of chemistry, and was never seen again. Sometime later, they found something very nasty in Dr. Webster's laboratory. And suspicion fell on the head of chemistry, Dr. Webster, whose textbook on chemistry was world famous. What they found inside the privy of Dr. Webster were skeletal remains attached to a long strip of intestines and an odd bit of male genitalia. A head was found in his furnace in his laboratory. And letters began to arrive at the police, which claimed that Dr. Parkman had been taken on a boat and he was there and then he was going to be killed, and letters like this poured in. So when Dr. Webster was accused, tried, and brought before the three magistrates who represented justice in Boston in those days, one of the pieces of evidence was this note. And one of the things that needed to be addressed was, whose handwriting was this? Now, there were no handwriting experts per se in those days. The man who testified was a specialist in handwriting. He was a calligrapher. And he testified that he had seen Dr. Webster's handwriting many times before. And it was his opinion that this was Dr. Webster's handwriting disguised to look like that of an ill-educated man. And this was one piece of evidence which was accepted in those days and led to Dr. Webster's eventual execution. Now, the thing is that we really didn't know very much about handwriting analysis in those days. And we still have a great deal of fallacious information about it. For instance, there are people called graphologists who insist that they can tell by examining someone's handwriting what his or her emotional makeup is, whether he's honest, dishonest, given to temper tantrums, organized, not organized, and so on. It has been tested empirically many times. There is absolutely no evidence to back this up. What there is evidence of is that a well-trained forensic document examiner who's going to tell you, well, this paper was made up of such and such, probably produced at such and such a place. The ink has been analyzed. The ink includes such and such. And that is absolutely accurate. And when it comes to whose signature it is, this is something that you can do only with a great deal of skill, a tremendous amount of practice, and has nothing at all to do with your emotional makeup. There is a famous story about that, about a conference they had once where a bunch of reporters got a hold of some scrap paper that had been written on by some very well-known people, including Tony Blair, who was the Prime Minister of Britain at the time. And they got a hold of a scrap of paper, which was doodles and things, and they gave it to a graphologist who claimed he could tell you something about the emotional makeup of the person who had written. And he said, this is a person who was never meant to be a leader. Unfortunately for them all, it turned out it was not written by Tony Blair. It was written by Bill Gates. Yes, such an embarrassment to everyone. Right. But a perfectly good example of why graphology and handwriting analysis, which involves emotional makeup, doesn't stand up the way forensic document examination does.
Right. Excellent. So yeah, the graphology, bunch of malarkey, but you know, when you're actually looking
at they get mad at me when I say that, but they can't come up with a study which demonstrates that they know what they're talking about.
Right. All right. So let's look at another kind of example. I love that example. Here's another one. This is phrenology, right? So could you share a little bit more about this particular kind of quackish method?
Well, it was believed in those days by certain people, certainly a man by the name of Fowler, that you could divide the skull into certain areas, and that one particular area would control your sexual feelings. Another part would control your appetite. Another part would control your musical ability, and so on. Now, there is a certain vague amount of truth to it. I mean, we do know there are certain parts of the brain which are involved with motor control, impulse control. But this kind of precision, where it's precisely this part of the brain, is absolute nonsense. And Mark Twain, who was of a very scientific bent, was in London and went to see a famous phrenologist. Mark Twain disguised himself, used a false name, and asked to have his skull read. So a profile was drawn up for him, and he thanked the man very much, the practitioner, and he went off back home with it. And a few months later came back wearing a different disguise with another name and had it done again. And of course, the two profiles did not match at all, but the head had been the same. Mark Twain, a man ahead of his time.
Indeed. Oh.
Oh, by the
Wow.
way, if you ever find a genuine Fowler head at a good price, buy it. They're quite valuable.
Are they made out of porcelain? Just out of curiosity, is that
Now, many of them were made out of porcelain, and many old-time doctors used to have them as a joke, kind of, put up on their bookcase.
fun? So could you describe for us? A lot of our volunteers here have been involved with our Power of Poison exhibit, which is a really fascinating exhibit. Really dives into some of the ways that poison has been used throughout history and what it some of the science of poison. What's kind of the evolution of research into and kind of the uses of those tests for poison? To see if a victim's been intentionally poisoned. We'd love to kind of hear a little bit more, the Marsh test, that kind of thing.
Well, the thing is that, as Paracelsus said centuries ago, the poison is in the dose. If you imbibe enough water, you will die. What we think of as a highly poisonous substance is one which you will die if you take only a little bit. Now, arsenic, of course, was everybody's great favorite. An Arab chemist named Jabir was the first one to refine it so that took it out of the soil and turned into a nice white powder which had very little taste, so that it could be added to the fluid of your choice or the food of your choice. The problem with arsenic, of course, was that there was no test for it up until Marsh. There were tests, but they were not accurate. They were very vague. What it came down to is arsenic smells a lot like garlic. And so if they opened a body and it reeked of garlic and he'd had a lot of stomach pains before he died, doctors were very apt to testify the person died of arsenic. Problem here is there's something else that smells like that. Garlic. So, I mean, if you're just eating a pizza and the circumstances look suspicious, you see the problem. Now, Marsh, of course, came up with this test, which was complicated but worked. Reinsch was building on Marsh's work, came up with a simpler but very similar, more accurate form of it. We are still using it in crime laboratories today. But when it comes to poison, you don't find what you don't look for. In other words, a corpse comes into a medical examiner's office today. They will run a basic panel of heavy metal tests, arsenic being one of them. But there are many, many poisons. And unless they've got some reason to suspect one of the others, they may never find it.
Right.
So this is always going to be a problem. And yes, of course, there are poisons that are very hard to find. There are also ones that are growing in your garden, even as we speak.
That's right.
Everything from hyacinths and calabar bean, anything, if properly processed, can be very dangerous.
So I have a kind of, this is going to wrap up my questioning here, and then we'll open up to the audience here in a minute. But I was wondering kind of what you found maybe most surprising as far as the connections between Sherlock Holmes and forensics. Like what was just something that was like, wow, I just had no idea, or a discovery that you really felt like was meaningful?
Well, the thing about Sherlock Holmes is that he was a generalist. He did a little bit of everything. He used to beat corpses to see how bruises would emerge. This is one of the problems we have to this very day. Was the bruise on the body pre-mortem or ante-mortem? We can't always tell. He really got his hands dirty doing a whole bunch of things, including some very unfortunate dogs got involved. But he also kept a library of old cases, because he used to say, that there's nothing really new under the sun, Watson. And he would say to his sidekick, Watson, make a long arm, Watson, and get me down the case of, Parkman Webster, by the way, was one that he knew well, because he always felt that criminals would repeat their historic crimes, that there was always a slightly new form of it, but it was the same. Footprints, for instance. Now, he was fascinated by footprints. He said no one paid enough attention to them. We're still using that today. When you watch crime scene guys walk onto a scene, they've got their own shoes covered with plastic booties to make sure that they don't leave false prints to confuse the issue. Now, Holmes was in many ways, because he was so well versed in so many things, he could apply it, and always his method, which has come down to us and is still used.
It's wonderful. So the methods really shape the ability to solve that crime, right? That's
what fantastic. He said was, once you've eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, no matter how fantastic it seems, must be the truth.
Excellent. All right. Thank you so much, EJ. And now what I'd like to do is have everybody give you a big round of applause for that section. Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for persisting with the technology, too, for this piece. And we're so glad that it's working well for us today. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hand the microphone here to Rachel, who's going to walk around and just raise your hand if you have a question for EJ, and we'll have a little dialogue here.
Was Conan Doyle, did his presentation of forensics with Sherlock Holmes push Scotland Yard into using better methods, or did the two kind of develop in parallel?
I think that Conan Doyle made the idea of applying scientific reasoning to criminal investigation understandable to the middle class. And this was a period where people were reading in large numbers, the penny dreadfuls, the newspapers. Sherlock Holmes was a great success. The idea that this could be done egged on Scotland Yard. We didn't have a laboratory, by the way, in England until a scientific laboratory until 1935, which is quite late.
Wow.
But one of the reasons we were able to do this is because people were now willing to pay taxes to support it. And one reason was that their interest was aroused by the Sherlock Holmes stories.
Thank you.
Could you talk about evidentiary hearings and how they decide whether a science can be presented in a court of law?
Well, I can tell you in the United States, there's a big issue here. We used to have what we called Fry hearings, where before a new science could be demonstrated, you had to demonstrate to the judge. You had a hearing before the trial, trying to explain how accurate the science was. Now we have some states accept the Daubert ruling, which is a little bit different, and it's a different standard. It's supposed to demonstrate overwhelming scientific acceptance. The trouble, of course, is that there really is no such thing as forensic science. What there is a couple of really hard sciences like mathematics, toxicology, chemistry, which have been used. You can replicate the results. And then you've got disciplines like trace evidence, fingerprints, which are more interpretive and more subjective. And all of these go into the hopper. So unfortunately, we do not have in the United States and in large parts of Europe and England as well, we don't have a really good common accepted standard. For fingerprints, for instance, Scotland Yard says you've got to have 20 points of similarity to say two fingerprints are identical. The FBI here, laboratory here, didn't have a standard at all. Someone looked at it, eyeballed it, and said that's the same. That looks like the same finger to me in my experience. And he could be right, but you can't demonstrate it the way I can demonstrate arsenic being present.
Sure. That's fascinating. So even disciplines, I mean, you throw in maybe anthropology or some other disciplines, and of course it's going to vary widely amongst these different forensic laboratories and the people that are doing the investigations. Is that something that you've seen? I'm just going to throw in a question here.
There is an enormous difference. I mean, we have some laboratories which are excellent. Where I am, Suffolk County, I'm telling you, we really, they're great. But we also have laboratories in small parts of the United States. Denver has a very good medical examiner's office with a very good crime lab attached to it. But there are many places, New York State has got something like 40 counties. We don't even have a medical examiner system there. And the result is that things are handled sloppily. Evidence is not preserved properly. It is underfunded terribly. And unfortunately, politicians have a lot to answer for. District attorneys are elected officials. They'll run on their conviction rate, which puts pressure on the crime lab, as you can imagine. Right now, we are trying to get some kind of national standard developed. There is a group which evaluates forensic laboratories, and there are some labs which are accredited and some which are not. We all need to do something about this. I will get off my soapbox.
No, I actually, if you could stay on your soapbox just for one more minute, and I'm gonna stop asking questions, and I'll let you all ask questions. But what is the kind of role of history, and in particular, I'm just gonna say it. What's the role of your book in trying to make that argument, maybe?
Well, what I did in my book was take old classic cases and show you how Sherlock Holmes was involved with them, and how Conan Doyle very often used these true cases to develop a fictional one. There are places you can absolutely see it. There's a body, with a very famous case where a body was found having been thrown off a train on the tracks miles away from where the train was. How did it get there? Who killed him? This particular case was worldwide famous because the perpetrator escaped taking the wrong hat with him. He took the victim's hat and left his own behind. Those unpleasant little experiences that criminals so often run into. And he ran away to the United States, where he was arrested and brought back for trial to England. Well, Conan Doyle wrote a story that was obviously based on it. So I had a lot of fun going back into these old cases and matching them with what really happened, what the science was, what the science was not yet able to do. Once in a while, Mr. Holmes made a mistake. It broke my heart, but I tell the truth.
Drew a wrong conclusion based on what he was seeing.
Well, he himself would admit it. And he says to Watson in one of the stories, if I ever seem too sure of myself, Watson, just mention the word Norwood to me.
Can you speak to the accuracy of the psychological profiles that, at least you see a lot of it on TV?
I'm sorry if I take a moment here. This is my research assistant, Wigan. She's 2 years old and a bit of a pest. I'm going to hand her. She's in charge of paper shredding in my office. I'm sorry, could you repeat the question for me, please?
Can you speak to the accuracy of psychological profiling?
Profiling. Well, it's not so much that I think psychological profiling is not accurate, is that in many cases it's perfectly obvious. You know, there was a case where a woman was found murdered on the roof of her apartment building. It was clearly not a planned crime because it was committed with what was available. No one had brought a weapon there. There happened to be a young man living in the building who was an isolate, unmarried, and given to rages, and could not account for himself. So, of course, a profiler looking at that would say, you're looking for a young man who lives alone, who's an isolate, right? But a well-trained cop is going to come to exactly the same conclusion. The thing is that a lot of what they do is a matter of common sense. And they tend not to be quite as dramatically effective as a lot of journalists present them. And it's not the profilers particularly who are doing it. It's just that there's such good copy.
Mine is kind of similar. Where do you stand on bite evidence and arson? As you know, a very serious miscarriage of justice occurred in Texas where a man was executed for killing his family based on this arson expert, and I think after the fact we know. And I guess in general, I want to know, every now and then I see these things, and I wonder what the controls are. And why doesn't somebody say, what are the controls?
All right. I'm full disclosure. I've worked on a couple of these cases. I know the one you're referring to is Wellingham. I was appalled by it. Jerry Hurst, who is a genuine, terrific arson expert, gave testimony in that case, and they wouldn't accept it. They wouldn't read it. They executed the man anyway, even though I think he proved pretty conclusively, if you read his paper on the subject, that the evidence given by the so-called arson expert who appeared at the trial was not well trained, and it is absolutely appalling to me that we cannot develop a reasonable standard. I would start with asking Dr. Hurst to set up the standards. And by the way, I've interviewed him on my blog, so you can read his views in detail. We do have people who do understand these things, and they did it by deliberately burning down houses to watch how the flames progressed. They didn't just reconstruct it after the fact. And they repeated it, and they replicated their results. And they're perfectly willing to do it again. We need more people like that. And we need to put some serious money into this instead of just trundling people off to the execution shed.
Yeah. Now, could you tell us, I think some of our team might be really interested in knowing the blog that you just referenced. If you could tell us that address, we'd love to write that down.
Oh, it's EJ Dissecting Room.
EJ Dissecting Room.
At WordPress.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
And volunteers, we can also link that on the volunteer portal for you.
My question is, you've commented on historically Western thought with Conan Doyle, et cetera. Could you comment on what was happening in the other part of the world, historically speaking? I'd just like to know if there's more history to that.
Well, actually, the Western world, I mean, if you talk about England and the United States, we were rather backwards. The earliest known work on forensic science, forensic pathology, is a book called The Washing Away of Wrongs, which was published in China hundreds of years ago. And there's a fascinating story in it, which is still good work today, which is so amazing to me, about a man who was killed by a sharp instrument left out in a field. And the investigator invited everybody to bring their scythes with which they were harvesting and put them on the ground. And the one that the flies landed on was the one that had the blood of the murdered man on it. And this was an incredible observation. It still makes sense today. Central Europe, as a matter of fact, was way ahead of us in terms of forensic sciences. Hans Gross was a great criminalist who was a lawyer by training, very analytical mind. Again, there's an article about him on EJ Dissecting Room. He was doing very seminal work, writing in German at the same time that Conan Doyle was writing. Now, Conan Doyle studied ophthalmology in Germany, so he could read German. And although we don't know for sure how much of Hans Gross he read, he obviously read quite a bit. So we were very influenced. England was very influenced by what was happening in Hungary, for instance, and in Austria, in Graz.
Really interesting. So, one up the front here.
Well, your mention of flies made me wonder about the use of insects and their life cycles and things to assist in.
We're learning more
investigation.
about that all the time, because one of the big problems in pathology has always been determining time of death. And because insects will light very quickly on a dead body or on a wound, the way in which they deposit their little eggs and the eggs develop into larvae and so on, if you get a good entomologist, someone who has studied the effect of insects on the death cycle, very often you pick up some very interesting information. But you've always got to be careful and aware of the variables, because sometimes a body has been brought from one place to another, taking a strange insect with it. So it's a very complex field, but very interesting one. And it's been very often very useful.
There does seem to be a buzz about that.
Oh, so.
I don't know if you can see it, but I'm getting booed off the stage. It's really.
I can't see it, but I do get the feeling. Yes.
Yes. You share the feeling. I see another question up here over the front.
Thank you. My second question is, Conan Doyle doesn't think much of the cops. And do you think that the attitude in the Sherlock Holmes stories has anything to do with how we feel about police today? And do you think that his attitude when he was writing these stories was justified?
Well, the British people had been very, very slow to accept the idea of a police force at all. They felt it infringed on civil liberties. They felt more comfortable with what they had at the beginning was a system of what they called thief takers. In other words, if you lost something in a burglary, you hired your own guy to go out and try to recover the goods. And you paid him with a portion of the goods that were recovered. So, of course, what ensued was obvious. There was one rather well-known thief taker called Jonathan Wild, who was a bit of an entrepreneur and proceeded to burglarize houses and then recover the goods. At this point, he was eventually caught and tried and hanged, but it became apparent to people that possibly something might give up a little bit of their civil liberties so that they wouldn't be held up all the time by thief takers. And as a result, it was from that group, though, that they formed a police force. I think Conan Doyle used the bumbling policeman as a foil, as a dramatic device, because obviously, if they were terrific at their job, what would be the point of Sherlock Holmes?
Sure.
I don't really think that is why we, in many places, view the police with suspicion. I think there's a lack of understanding of what police investigation is like, and there have been obvious cases where the police have behaved rather badly and have been seen as a force which is very oppressive towards lots of minority groups, for instance, people are afraid of. So I think we kind of need to rethink this, but I wouldn't lay it at Conan Doyle's door.
That makes sense. I think there's one right here.
Yes, what do you think of the modern Sherlock Holmes with Cumberbatch and cell phones and so on?
Well, I think it's vigorous. Um, I I myself am a bit of a traditionalist in these matters. I kind of like the idea of the fog and the rain on the cobblestones and the horse-drawn hansom cabs rattling over them and sitting up in front of a warm fire and enjoying a three-pipe problem with my pal Watson. So I don't know. I don't think there's anything wrong with reinterpreting Sherlock Holmes at all. I mean, that's fine. But I tend to look at it as something completely separate from the Holmes stories.
Interesting. Do we have any final questions to kind of wrap us up here? I think there's one right over there. All right. Actually, a couple maybe. We might have time for two. I might have spoken too quickly. We'll see if we can get into here.
You're talking about the medical examiner's offices was interesting. Recently there has been a NOVA program called the Poisoner's Handbook concerning the New York City, the establishment of the New York City Medical Examiner's Office. Could you just talk about that story a little bit? It was fascinating.
Well, one thing about the medical examiner's office in New York City was that the original practitioners, the original holders of that office were excellent physicians. They were also privately wealthy. And this was a very unfortunate thing, but they were so poorly funded that I think what was the first office in 1915, Charlie Norris had to spend a lot of his own money just to provide microscopes. So for a long time, this was sort of a stepchild. It really was. And it's only fairly recently that we have been able to branch out and put some money in it. And there are still problems from time to time because we just have a burgeoning population. The more people you have, the more sudden death, unexplained death you have. And certainly, I think the New York Medical, that's where I saw my very first autopsy, was in the New York City Medical Examiner's Office. We've had some extraordinarily fine people there. Dr. Charles Hirsch, for instance, who came from Suffolk County, where I am, to New York, was an exemplary pathologist. And there's never enough money and there's never enough funding, and most people simply don't really understand why it's important until they're confronted with the need for their services.
That's a great point. It looks like James Hagedorn, our curator, has a question here for you.
Okay, this is a hypothetical question, but I hope it's a fun one. And that is, if you could time travel and go back and actually meet Sherlock Holmes in his world, is there something that you've always wondered about or puzzled over that you would ask him? And it could be something fun or it could be something scientific. But is there something that we've not quite ever figured out that will be interesting?
Well, there are a number. I'd like to discuss Parkman Webster with him. I've often thought about that. There are a lot of holes in that confession. I'd like to say, Mr. Holmes, could you make a long arm and reach down my copy of the testimony in that case? I've got a little earmark here. Maybe you could tell me what you think happened.
That's great. Could you tell the case again? Could you say the case name for that one again?
Parkman Webster.
Thank you. EJ, we just had a delightful time with you this afternoon. We want to thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we really, really appreciate it. So thank you again, and we will connect up with you a little bit later today for our second session. But again, thank you, and have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.
All right, now it's time for Rachel. Rachel, come on down. I'll try to get your PowerPoint up here.
Alrighty, so the documents that you are going to want to locate for my very brief presentation are the documents that say at the top, Sherlock Holmes, Exhibition Logistics. And there's another document that has a one-page safety information, and on the back of it has some chaperone guide information, just 2 pages. And they are white. Excuse me. Sherlock Holmes, temporary exhibit operations, Wendy says. And those are pass out today. So if your neighbor's having problems finding the documents, maybe you could help them. If you have found the documents, they are a continuation of our exhibit operations from previous exhibits. Sorry, my P's are being really loud. So if you find our exhibit operations for the power of poison, they should sequentially come following that. And they should go under a tab that is a gray tab. That is one that you should have from previous exhibitions. Okay, so while you guys are organizing that, I'm going to move us along so you can get to our cookies. And how about if you're struggling with any of this, I would really love to help you during the break. You can just meet me at that round table and we can all work on figuring out where those documents maybe ended up or where they belong together. Does that sound okay? Great. All right, so Sherlock Holmes will be opening for our member day on October 22nd. And it will open for the public on the 23rd. And this exhibition will go just a little bit longer than the Power of Poison until January 31st. This is a surcharged exhibition, and I'll go through the specifics of that a little bit more in a second. Our rules remain the same. Oh, sorry, there's a typo in my PowerPoint, which is completely contradicting itself. Photography is allowed as long as there is no flash. So I'm sorry, flash photography is not allowed. No, wait, my PowerPoint is okay. Never mind. I'm sorry, guys. I was like not sleeping well last night. Okay, you can take non-flash photography in Sherlock Holmes. It's the same as a lot of exhibitions that we've had as of late. And there are going to be extended hours over the holidays, but please note that those extended hours are only going to be for Sherlock Holmes and not for the Power of Poison as well. So Sherlock is a ticketed exhibition that is surcharged, and we haven't had an exhibition like this since Silk Road, which ended in May of this year. So the advantage of having the timed exhibition, as you very well know, is that it does have a more controlled exhibit entry. So right now, the sale of the tickets is set that there are 75 tickets available for purchase every 15 minutes. So that means we should never see more than that many people come through the door at any given time. There is a kiosk around the corner from the entrance to Phipps Gallery and right next to the gift shop that will offer guests the option to purchase tickets there, both members and non-members. And that kiosk has a sign with the prices on it. And one of the things that I always personally recommend is I never quote the price because I always get it wrong. And then I have someone come up to me and say, you said that the ticket price was blah, blah, blah. So if you have someone come up to you and ask you what the prices are, there's going to be a sign at the kiosk. The sign will always be there, and the sign will have the right prices and information that they need to know. And that kiosk is located there so that folks will not have to go downstairs to purchase their tickets. and can just do them on spot. That being said, though, there are some options for ticket sales after the 3:45 time slot. So let me talk about that a little bit. So there are the member prices list here. There are non-member prices that is included in the museum admission price. I know sometimes that number looks really big and scary when you see it, but remember the price is $9 plus the cost of admission, $8 plus the cost of admission, $8 plus the cost of admission. So it's not the ticket for Sherlock Holmes is not $23.95. Yikes! It is plus admission. So one of the pricing options that's available to folks is that there is a extended hours price. So that means any tickets that are sold beyond our regular hours. And those tickets will be a little bit more than the daytime tickets for non-members. The member pricing will stay the same, but it is an option available to people. And these prices are just during our extended hours. There is an option for people if they come up to the exhibit and you work an afternoon shift, and it is after the exhibit recommended sales ticket closing time, which is 3:45. And that option is a blue admission ticket. So I wanted to mention these two tickets because you might see them at the ticketing station, and one of them is completely okay to see, and the other one will have to unfortunately advise people to go back downstairs. And I'll also put this at the ticketing station so that it will be right there for you to use. So if someone comes up to you at 3:47, they are not going to be able to buy a ticket to Sherlock Holmes on the kiosk. But there is an option for them to go downstairs to buy what's called an anytime ticket. And this ticket is also a ticket that if someone is a certain level of donor or a VIP person, that we would give them this ticket. And this ticket affords anyone access to Sherlock at any time. So you won't see a stamp time on it, but it does say Sherlock admission. So that means that this ticket does not need to be exchanged, and it can be scanned at the ticketing scanner. The advantage of this ticket offering people the chance to see Sherlock even after our final ticket time is that happens so often, I think. But we know that we've also recommended a certain amount of time that people go through the exhibition. So they're buying this ticket with that risk in mind. You know, sometimes people want to just go see it right then and there, and we want to make that option available to them. They do go down to the ticketing desk, though, so that's verbally stated to them. And they don't come out of the exhibit and say, well, I couldn't possibly have gotten through that in 15 minutes, and you sold me a ticket. They are told that when they purchase the ticket that you're buying the ticket after we recommended guests to stop buying tickets. You did that full knowingly. Have fun anyway. So, a ticket you will see that needs to be exchanged is a voucher. And anytime we see a voucher, that usually does need to be exchanged. Thankfully, the only one that you would ever have to stress about is for Sherlock. So a voucher means somebody has to go and exchange that ticket at the front desk. And in fact, this ticket should scan red. It should tell you when you are at the ticketing scanner, if you accidentally scan it, that ticket cannot be redeemed. So those are two unique tickets. There will be no touchscreen. You will just scan. It will be awesome. Easy, right? So we do have extended hours. And the way that our extended hours have worked in the past is that you guys very, very, very kindly work an extra half an hour on these days. So your shift will be, instead of from 8:30 to 1, 8:30 to 1:30, and instead of 12:30 to 5, 1 to 6. So we will talk about this more and remind each other more of it. I will need reminders too as the time approaches. But we usually have done it in the past, and we'll continue to do it over our fall break and Thanksgiving, as well as over our winter break, Christmas and New Year's. And there's a couple of holidays in there that are we're missing the extended hours, one being Thanksgiving and the other being New Year's. During these days, the last ticket will be sold at 5:45, and the gallery will close at 7. Again, you guys do not stay until the gallery is open. You leave at 6. And also, that being said, remember too, the Power of Poison will not be open. So it will only need enough folks to stay for Sherlock, and I greatly appreciate you taking that extra time to do that during the busy holidays. People come in from out of town, and it's really nice, I think, for them to have some additional hours to get to see the exhibit. So thank you so much for doing that. School groups. I got a wonderful compliment about you guys from the school group desk the other day. They have been bringing in the entire school district of Adams 50, and you guys have seen this happen, and you have been working with these students, and the school group desks are so thankful to you. They've been able to have the opportunity to go to these professional development classes. The teachers are when the students are coming to see the museum, and like the school year's already hardly even started, and you guys are so awesome. So thank you. They told me to make sure to tell all of that to you in a large group like that. So thank you so much. So school groups for Sherlock will be timed and will, again, just like the other guest, have a limit on the number of students that are able to come. So we won't have crazy, insane walk-up groups like we did for Mythic Creatures. It will be regulated and timed. So the easiest way to know just visually if a school group is going to Poison or if they're going to Sherlock Holmes is by the color of the chaperone's wristband. And that wristband is yellow for Sherlock Holmes, and it's going to be red if they're just a general admission guest going to Poison. If anybody wanted to add Sherlock Holmes without a reservation, unfortunately you have to send them back down to the school desk. It's not something that you guys can help them with. And one of the things that they're going to receive is something that I made a copy of that is a resource to you, and that's a one-page exhibit guide. It's the chaperone guide. And that's going to be something that's available to the teachers and chaperones before they ever get to the exhibit. And we hope that that guide that Jill worked really hard on will really help them to set their priorities in terms of what do they want to see, what are the activities that the students can do, and how can we really maximize our time and our experience in the exhibition. So you have an English copy, but the copy that will be available to the schools and the teachers will be both English and Spanish. It's a really nice guide too if you guys want to try it out when you go see the exhibit. It does a really succinct, tight job of explaining the areas and what's going on, and hopefully will help you have a good visit too. So our positions in Sherlock are as follows. So I chose these pictures not to embarrass Betty and Jean and Sandy, but because I was out taking photos for our recognition dinner when Mythic was still in session, and these guys were just having the most fun ever outside of the exhibit. And I wanted to mention that while we're talking about ticket scanners and greeters, because they are not the most glamorous of positions. I know this. But these guys had puppets, and they were talking like the puppets were the greeters, and they were making everyone feel so welcome, and like they were so excited that they were there. They weren't listing off the rules. They weren't, telling people what they couldn't do. They were glad that they were there, and they were so excited for them to begin their experience in Temper exhibits. And that's just something I want to reemphasize. You guys have such an impact on the visitor experience, and that experience starts at the second that they start walking into our queue and the second they interact with a greeter. And so one of the things that Jacqueline and I have been talking a lot about is this idea of the platinum rule, that this is the only rule that we should be focusing on, which is the focus on the person standing in front of you. How do they want to be treated? And how can you fulfill your role of positively impacting the guest experience? These guys, every single person that came through was so excited that they were there. It was awesome. Which means we've seen this slide before, haven't we? Yes, we have. Please let go of being a gatekeeper or being law enforcement. We see speeding signs all the time, but you're not like chasing down cars to tell people that they were just speeding, right? You do not need to feel like you're a law enforcement because that is not your role. That is a role of security. So I'm telling you right now, if an adult is chewing gum, they are an adult. I don't know, maybe there are adults that take their gum and like put it under things to be weird and cruel, but I don't know that many adults that are doing that. So please stop telling adults to spit out their gum. Please stop listing the rules. Okay, I'm saying this as a public service announcement and not, directed at any one person because it's really not happening that much. But the unfortunate thing that happens is I oftentimes hear about it when it does, and it's not in positive ways from guests. And I don't want anyone and anywhere to feel bad about it. I don't want you to feel bad. I don't want a guest to feel bad, because the whole point of you being here is to have fun, is to carry around puppets and just have fun, which you are actually very, 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 very good at. So there are some really fun places inside of Sherlock that you guys are going to be doing as well. We're going to get more into the meat of this next training, and we're actually going to have you guys see the exhibition first, because there's so much complexity to it. It's so Sherlockian that to talk about it in hypotheticals, I imagine you might actually kind of be frustrated right now. Like, oh, the room where this thing happens and then the mystery is this. We want you to go see it. And then we are going to talk more specifically about, oh, do you remember in the exhibit that this part that you did when you put this together? Do you remember that when you were there? We think that that will be a better experience. So what we're going to be doing in Sherlock, instead of having carts, and I've talked about this, I think, with the majority of you, is you're going to be focused on spaces. And I think that there's a lot of really great opportunity in this. So we're going to highlight very specific things within the rooms that you could choose to focus on that we know are maybe a little bit challenging for guests, and they'll need your support on it. So for example, in the London Underground, that telegraph is so cool, but you really need some help kind of understanding how to work it. Understanding how to do the detective notebooks, understanding how ballistics works, the cosmetology section, the botany section. So within this room, for example, there's already all of this information that you guys can add additional components to. And you can do it based upon your own interests. So if you're super into the Morse code, you can hang out at the Morse code. Whereas if somebody else is really, really interested in ballistics, they could hang out there. We think it could be really fun because you're getting to be excited about the things that you're excited about in the space, instead of just having to only talk about things that are fixed on a cart. And so in 221B Baker Street, there are some really fun things we're going to go over with, like with observation skills. Like, for example, when people walk in, have them close their eyes and then ask them to tell you what color the carpet is. Great observation. Are you seeing or are you observing? There's a long list of objects, which I don't want you to have a heart attack about, but they are listed for the guests to practice finding. We'll give you a resource of exactly where the object is, what story it came from, and what it looks like. It has a picture. But another really fun room to talk about observation in the scientific method. And then the last room, where I think that guests are really going to seek you out, and that I know Jennifer and I were hunting down the facilitators in this room when we went, is the crime scene. So there are those 4 areas where you try out different experiments and try to decide what matches up with how the crime scene looked and how the actual evidence speaks. So within all of these spaces, again, you're not having to be fixed at a spot. That absolutely doesn't mean, though, there will not be chairs, because I know that we need to have chairs, but you get to choose what makes you excited and then transfer that excitement over to the guests. The other really great resource that's going to be available to you, this is going to be on a big piece of paper. And what it is it's pretty much a summary of the entire crime scene and the entire exhibit's investigation stations. And so we're going to have this available for you to choose to carry around with you. So if you're in the big room that has all of the investigation stations at it, and all of the crime scene information, no matter where you are, you'll be able to pull this out and show guests and help to reorient them. Oh, do you remember that the thing in the crime scene with the gunshot was that it is there's a bullet hole above the fireplace. Oh, do you remember that what you're trying to figure out with the seed pod is if it's toxic? So this is something that you'll be able to use as kind of a one-stop shop, one-pager of all the information about the exhibit. So the last thing I wanted to mention, this is another quote that I actually used last training. Sorry, I'm duplicating things, but I think it's a really great quote. It's from a study that was done about museums and how we're trying to operate. It's an old study, but I like the sentiment of this quote because it's something that's happening at the museum, and it's something that you guys are supporting in incredible, incredible ways. So that you can read, but I will read it to you. Quite simply, more and more museums are putting themselves in their customers' shoes. They're adopting both the mindset and infrastructure to do what it takes to make visitors want to come, to feel welcome when they arrive, cared for and engaged during their stay, and by the time they leave, they're eager to return. And I just want to thank you for having fun, for being fun. Look at all these fun people. Look at Roma in her princess hat, who make guests have such a great experience here that they want to come back. You make their experience memorable and positive and happy, and you offer these priceless smiles that make their experience such a great one. So we are so grateful for you. And I have a surprise announcement that if you scrolled through my 10-page email, maybe you saw it, which is I can announce the exhibition that comes next. Robot Revolution. So, this is coming to us from the Museum of Science and Industry. Brian will be back in our ranks. And our curator is Steve Lee. Steve Lee is the space science curator. It has been, for me, a lot of fun working with Steve, and I hope a lot of fun for you guys. I put a lot of links about the exhibition on the portal that you can take a peek and look at. And we're also going to be doing another preview presentation, just like we did for chocolate. And this information is on the portal. It's in an email. I'm sure I will continue to email it to you more times than you'd like me to. We're going to do it on November 5th from 2 to 3 in room 102 and 103. And if you cannot make this, we are planning to record it so that you can experience the kind of family vacation style presentation of what robots is that Brian will share. If you wouldn't mind, as always, when I send out the information about it, RSVPing so there's an accurate count of cookies. The other event that we wanted to share is that we're going to do a Sherlock supplemental training with this hilariously named group. Their group name is Dr. Watson's Neglected Patients. Isn't that funny? Yeah, because what is Watson? Is he really a doctor? He's never talking to any patients. We're going to do that on November 18th from 6 to 8 in Classroom 201. And this is a group of Denver Sherlock enthusiasts. We're going to do a panel-style training where you can grill them on all the questions that guests are grilling you about and hopefully get some good information from this group. And again, I will make sure to send this out, and if you can RSVP, that would be great. And as always, look at this calming ocean to remember that while you feel overwhelmed right now, everything is going to be okay. How am I doing on time? Do I have time for questions? Do I? Hold on. Oh, I've gone over by 2 minutes. I think maybe I will take just a couple of questions, and I don't want to cut into your cookie time. Okay, Jean. Jean's question is, she noticed that there is not an exit monitor. What are we doing about an exit monitor in the exhibition? I am not assigning an exit monitor because that sounds like a horrible position. That sounds like not what I would like you to do, and a sure way to make sure that you don't have fun if you are monitoring people coming in and out of the exhibition. We know that people do it. We know that it happens. It does not happen enough that we are, like losing sleep over it. And the additional comment there is that is the job of security. And they are roving that space, and they know that that's a problem. Jim. Oh, so Jim just said when we have extended hours for extended hours for Sherlock, but not for Poison, how will the shifts work? Let's think about that together, because I had not thought about that. Thank you. Okay. Oh my gosh. I am going to try to individually answer your questions because I'm cutting into your cookie time, but I will gladly re-announce them if they are helpful to the whole group. Okay. Have a great break.